Hi guys, in this video we'll be deploying a full stack application to AWS with a front end built with Vue.js and a back end built with Node.js, Express and MongoDB, also known as an MEVN Stack app. We'll be following the steps in this tutorial that I've posted on my blog and I'll link to in the video description so you can follow along. As I mentioned, the MEVN Stack app stands for Mongo, Express, Vue, and Node. Other variations of the stack are the MEVN Stack, which has an Angular front end, and the MEVN Stack, which has a React front end. Now, in this tutorial, we'll be using a couple of example apps for the front end and back end that support user registration and login functionality. I won't be going into the detail of those applications themselves, but I've got a couple of other tutorials where they are covered if you're interested, and they're linked to from here. This is what we will be covering in this tutorial. We'll be first creating a server in AWS that runs Ubuntu, then connecting to the server via SSH, then we'll be setting up the server with all of the software that we need to run our full stack app. Then we'll deploy the backend API to it and configure that. Then we'll deploy the front-end Vue application to it. Then configure NGINX as the reverse proxy web server that will act as the gateway to both of the front-end and the back-end applications, so they can both be served from port 80 HTTP. And finally, we'll test the application to see that everything's worked successfully. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing we'll need to do is go to AWS to the console. So clicking this link here. And if you don't have an account yet, you can create a free account and follow the steps. Otherwise, log in. I've already logged in previously, so it won't ask me again for my username and password. Next, go to the EC2 section. And select Launch New Instance. Okay, next we want to find the Ubuntu AMI or Amazon Machine image for installing on our machine. So I'll select the free tier only images and then I'll enter Ubuntu into the search box. And it should be the first one. So Ubuntu Server 1804, select that. After the AMI is chosen, you want to choose T2 Micro as it's eligible for the free tier. It should be selected by default. And next we want to configure our security group. So we can skip over these next ones. We can leave all those as default and click Configure Security Group. By default, only SSH access is allowed to the server. We want to leave that there because we'll be connecting via SSH for configuring the server. We also want to be able to connect via HTTP, as this will be a web application and we'll be testing it via HTTP, so we want to be able to access it with that. There it is there. Okay. Next, review and launch, that our settings that we've selected are in there, and click Launch. Next, in order to connect via SSH, we'll use a private key. That private key is generated by AWS for you, so we'll choose to create a new key pair. So that's a public-private key pair, and we'll download the private key for connecting to the server. It can be named anything you like. I'll name this one my AWS key and download it here. And then click Launch Instance. And while that's launching, we can move over and begin the next step. So the next step will be to connect, but before we can connect, we'll need to make a small change to the SSH key that we've downloaded in order to connect via SSH. So I'm running on a Mac at the moment, which supports SSH, connecting via SSH by default natively. If you're running on Windows, there's a link here for instructions on downloading an SSH client called PuTTY, which you can use for connecting via SSH on Windows, which involves converting the key and doing some other small changes for connecting to your AWS server. But if you're on a Mac or another Unix-based box, you can follow the instructions that I'm going to do now. Also, if after we've connected to the server, the rest of the steps are performed on the server. So this is the only part where there's a variation between Windows and other operating systems. So the first step here is that we need to make our SSH key. We need to set the permissions on the private key in order for it to be accepted by the SSH client. Basically, we need to make it so it's not publicly accessible, and the way we do that is by running chmod and setting the permissions to 400 and passing the path to the file. So this is the path to my file, so I'm going to copy that command there and open a command window and run that there. Now if I list out my downloads directory, you can see that my AWS key here has read-only access, which is what we want. Now going back to AWS, if we go to view our instance, it should be up and running now. And so we should be able to connect via SSH. So once we've changed the permissions on our private key, then the next step is to copy the public DNS address from AWS, which is here on the overview. And it has a little handy copy to clipboard link, so you can copy it there. And in the terminal, you want to run the command ssh-i and then pass the path to your key file, then set the user to Ubuntu and then paste in your domain name that you've just copied to your server in order to connect. So going back to the terminal, ssh-i and the path to the key file, then Ubuntu at the server address, and I've forgotten to put -i. So let's just add that in there and say yes, that we trust this server. Okay, we are now connected to our AWS server. So next we want to set up our server, and it's install all of the software required to run our full stack app. That includes Node, MongoDB, NGINX, and a couple of other pieces in order to run Node in production, which is the PM2 process manager and a firewall. I won't go into the details of exactly how everything's installed, because I've covered it in a separate blog post here, which you can view and go into if you're interested in those details. For this video, all we need to do is copy this command and run it on the server, and that will install everything we need. So I'm going to paste that in there. And we see first it installs Node and MongoDB. PM2, which is the Node Process Manager. There's NGINX being installed. And UFW, which is a firewall for some added security at our server level. Okay, our server is now set up for running our MEVN Stack application. Next, we'll deploy the Node and MongoDB backend API. So we're going to deploy it into the opt backend directory. The way we'll do that is by cloning the code from GitHub with this command. So it'll clone from the GitHub repo into the opt backend directory on the server. So pasting that command in there. Next, we'll navigate into the directory and install all of the Node dependencies, all the dependent packages from using npm install. So that cds into the backend directory and runs npm install. And it's done. Next, we'll start the API using the PM2 process manager. The reason this is better than using Node, running Node directly, is because if you have any issues with running Node, if there's an error, Node will generally crash and stop. Whereas running it under a process manager means it'll automatically manage the process and restart Node if there is an error. So we'll use PM2 for running that. So pasting that in there, that starts our API under PM2. So that's done. So our API is now running on the server. It's currently listening on port 4000, which means that it's not accessible publicly. It'll only be accessible once we've finished configuring NGINX, which we'll be using to reverse proxy API requests through to the API running on port 4000, which will make sense in a couple of steps from now when we get there. For now, we'll move on to deploying our front-end Vuex, Vue.js and Vuex application. So we'll put our Vue app into the opt front-end directory. So the API in backend and the Vue.js in front-end. So copying the git clone command here. That will clone it into the opt front-end directory. And then performing the same steps, cding into that directory and installing all of the Node package dependencies. Next, by default, the Vue.js application is set up so it can run without a backend, with a fake backend. We are setting it up to run with the real backend that we just deployed. So we need to make a couple of small modifications to the code to remove the fake backend. So we'll use the nano text editor on the server to edit the front-end source index file and remove the bit that configures the fake backend. So if you run that command on the server, and this is our index file. So if we remove these 3 lines, Control K allows you to delete a whole line in one go. And then Control X to save the file, and Y for yes, and enter. Okay, then we want to configure the path to the API. So the API, as I said, it runs on port 4000 by default, so the default URL that's configured in Webpack for the front end points to localhost 4000, whereas we're actually going to be using NGINX to reverse proxy to the API on port 80 on the path /API. So we're going to update the API URL to just /API. So with the same text editor, we'll open up Webpack, the Webpack config file, and down at the API URL, we'll change localhost 4000 to /API, and Control X again to save, Y for yes, and enter. And finally, we'll build the front end with npm run build, and that'll package up the front end, transpile all the files, and compile them all into the dist folder using Webpack. So npm run build. Okay, that's done. So the Vue.js app is now built and ready to be served from the front-end dist directory. We'll be now configuring NGINX to serve the front end from the root path of the server, and to serve API requests to proxy those through from the /API path. So this is the configuration file for NGINX. It's saying here that it's going to be listening on port 80. This is the root path of the server that will be serving the front-end dist files for the Vue.js app. And this is the API path that will be proxying to localhost 4000, which is our Node.js API. Okay, so first of all, when we installed NGINX, it comes with a default site config file. Rather than going in and manually removing all the lines of that and then putting in our config, a quicker way is just to delete the file and then recreate it. So you can remove the file by running this command. Then we can recreate it with our nano editor with this command. And simply copy the contents and paste them in there. Same thing again to save, Control X, Y, and enter. And for NGINX to load the new config, we want to restart it by running this command here. Okay, there's a reference of the NGINX config pieces there if you're interested in the details, as well as links to the NGINX config, NGINX documentation website. Okay, finally all of our setups done, so we should be able to test our application. So if we go back to the AWS console, copy the public DNS record for our server and paste it into a new tab, we should hopefully see our application. Okay, great. Now I'll open up the dev tool so we can see if it's see the requests hitting the actual API and not a fake backend. So if I register the user, register, you can see that the request was made and it went to API users register. Registration was successful, and now I can log in. Okay, that's it. That's how you set up a server in AWS to support the MEVN Stack and deploy an application to it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more, subscribe to my channel below. Alright, cheers.